You've undoubtedly already seen the painting, The Swing, in one form or another. We're told by the 18th century writer Charles Corday that starving artist Jean-Honoré Fragonard was approached by an unnamed gentleman of the court with a commission so scandalous that another painter had already rejected it outright. Corlay's account came directly from Gabriel François Doyen, the painter who had passed on the project, and it went as follows. A gentleman of the court sent for me in order to commission a painting. He was at his pleasure house, or petite maison, with his mistress when I presented myself. I should like, he said, to have you paint Madame, pointing to his mistress, on a swing that a bishop would push. You will paint me in such a way that I would be able to see the legs of this lovely girl, and better still, if you want to enliven your picture a little more. Although he refused to deliver the desired composition, Doyen did suggest a witty addition. The lady's shoes should come off and be caught by a band of flying cupids. It is rare for such unusual and specific instructions to have come down to us, and it seems at first that Fragonard stuck painstakingly to his brief. Most of the desired elements are there, from the frothy billowing skirt, to the arched stocking foot, to the cushioned swing. Even Doyen's proposal is partially incorporated. A tiny shoe flies through the air under the watchful eyes of the statue menacing Cupid. This painted detail was modeled upon the statue with which the sculptor Falconet had shown to considerable acclaim at the Salon of 1757. On the surface, it is difficult to imagine a more fitting representation of the final years of France's Ancien Régime than the scene of love in a secluded rural setting, captured at the crucial moment just before a pink satin shoe drops. And indeed, during the so-called rococo revival of the 19th century, with its nostalgic outpourings of affection for the wit and opulence of courtly life, the swing was held up as emblematic of the lost aristocratic pleasures and the bygone playfulness of the pre-industrial era. It was, in other words, made synonymous with the rococo style, typically described as a highly decorative aesthetic founded upon the principles of asymmetry, illusion, and wit. In the 20th century, the painting's risque glamour and mischievous playfulness were harnessed by just about everyone, from fashion designer Vivienne Westwood to shoe designer Manolo Blahnik to cheesemaker Petit Munster. Today, from our 21st century vantage point, the discussions that we're now able to have about art complicate how we see the swing and the rococo lifestyle it embodies. Social tensions run high, concerns about sustainability trump luxury, and the voyeuristic act inscribed at the heart of the painting can be seen to fly in the face of the advances wrought by the Me Too movement. In 2011, the installation artist Yinka Shonibare restaged the central female figure as a headless form, clad in African print wax textiles. This was a literal allusion to the fate of the French aristocrats who lost their lives to the guillotine, but may also suggest the head-turning extravagance of the Ancien Régime that had resulted in a loss of reason, of morality. The decision to clothe his headless protagonist in African prints mirrors the decorative quality of the original dress, while emphasizing the constructed nature of the wearer's identity, which is perhaps defined on terms that are not her own. One might imagine that the degree to which the woman possesses agency or not would give rise to heated debate, given the unbridled intensity with which the man looks up the woman's dress, the seeming complicity of this woman who has kicked off her own shoe, the disingenuous way in which the artist has served up and papered over the problematic scene in incongruously pretty pastel hues. But here's the funny thing I've noticed about the swing. People don't actually look at the painting. And I'm showing the swing as it used to hang in the oval drawing room, slightly lost in a sea of beautiful works by François Boucher. Somewhere between Manolo Blahnik and Disney movies, it seems to have taken on the dubious honor of being flattened into a chocolate box poster, an image. Everyone knows it appears in the film Frozen or in a Mariah Carey music video, but they forget it's an actual work of art. one that has been called one of the greatest paintings of all time, one that hangs on the walls of a national museum. I wasn't planning on working on the swing. I came to the Wallace just after organizing the exhibition Fragonard, the Fantasy Figures, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And I felt that I had said what I had to say about this artist, at least for the moment. Nonetheless, I was fascinated by the strange push and pull between the swing's status as an icon and its complete detachment from anything that concerns us today. From a curatorial and educational perspective, it was a fascinating challenge. How does one speak about a work like this to young people, specifically to young women? How does one make relevant and interesting a painting like this, and by extension, the Rococo period in general? Proposing responses to these questions has been something of a driving force for me over the past 3 years. A few months ago, we began the final phase of a project involving the swing that has been a long time in the making. It was the culminating stage of a capital initiative to improve the so-called inner loop galleries at the Wallace Collection. These are the second floor drawing rooms that display the majority of our collections of 18th century French art. Paintings by the likes of Watteau, Lancret, Greuze, or Boilly, furniture by Riesner, porcelain by the Sèvres Manufactory. The project has entailed cleaning the silks and the curtains, sending out the chandeliers for rewiring, and installing new directional LED lighting throughout 9 galleries of art. And I'm showing you here a before picture, before the works occurred, of our small drawing room where Watteau reigns supreme, followed by an after picture, which shows how much more evenly the light is now distributed over the works of art. This push has also involved extensive conservation, whether to preemptively protect or to restore our works of art. Most logistically challenging was when Francois Boucher's enormous canvases, The Rising and Setting of the Sun, came off the wall to be gently surface cleaned, a process that entailed building a temporary platform over our main staircase. Over the past couple of years, the generous support of a group of benefactors has also enabled us to conserve 4 works by Fragonard, thereby ensuring that the artist was looking his absolute best in his representation at the Wallace Collection. The 5th and final painting by Fragonard on the list for treatment was, of course, The Swing. We thought hard about how to go about approaching this work. Happily for us, a grant from Bank of America enabled us to purchase the equipment necessary to conserve the work on site in one of our upstairs furniture conservation studios. While we typically need to outsource our painting conservation projects, keeping the swing on site was of crucial importance, given its status and importance to the collection. Thanks to the work of former head of the National Gallery's Conservation Department, Martin Wild, the swing went back on the wall earlier this month. It's now hung with our ensemble of paintings by Fragonard, a total of 8 works that span the entire evolution of his career, from his student days up until the last years of the Ancien Regime. Up until now, these works have been dispersed over 3 different galleries, but visually and conceptually, it has felt much more impactful to install them together. Looking at the swing. If people have gotten out of the habit of seeing the swing, this is also because the painting has not looked its best for a very long time. In the 19th century, the Goncourt brothers complained about its condition, stating, "What remains after harsh cleaning and repainting has the true air of a passing copy." And it has been more than 30 years since the Wallace Collection's former director, John Ingemels, mentioned in print the thick discolored varnish that until recently covered its surface. In the past, one way to keep the work on the wall was to resaturate its surface through the addition of more and more varnish, and the removal of these layers has resulted in a dramatic change. Cleaning has brightened the colors and sharpened the details immeasurably, reminding us of the sheer force of this artist's technical prowess. What was less expected was that the newly visible details inject a more ambiguous and complicated dimension to the painting than has previously been thought. Nothing has surfaced to make us doubt the circumstances of the commission, nor its careful stipulations. The agreed upon details, woman, dress, swing, shoe, are all present. But there's also enough to suggest that the painting was designed to open itself to other narratives, several, in fact. The man who activates the swing is now clearly visible. His face, as he looks up toward the woman, is unmistakably aged, the evident discoloration of his teeth and skin in sharp contrast to the luminous complexion of the young woman. He has been described as a bishop, an obscure accomplice, even as a gardener whose abandoned rake lies in the foreground. But the shimmering blue touches on the fabric of his suit suggest a richer fabric than has previously been thought. Certainly, he does not wear the black robes of a clergyman, but he also does not seem to be a manservant, pressed into entertaining his superiors. At the same time, his improved wardrobe does not promise a better outcome for him. Water bubbles over the surface of the bench and will soon drench the elegant black hat that rests beside him. If he seems oblivious to the impending damage to his hat, the little white dog at his feet seems all too aware. Previously, this small animal had appeared simply excited, in parallel with the animated movements of the woman on the swing. Now he seems furious, eyes blazing, jaw hanging open. Perhaps he belongs to the older man rather than the younger woman. And if there is a little stream at the foot of the bench, which the presence of water flowing from under Pootie and a dolphin suggests, we're made to understand that the dog is in an unstable position. His front paws rest on the trellis, but his hind legs are balanced at the edge of the stream if they're not already in it. On the other side of the painting, the figure lying under the sign of Falconet's menacing Cupid has also benefited from cleaning. His dove gray suit has gained a smart blue lining. His face has attained an unmistakable flush of pink. And his figure has achieved a new physicality. Whereas previously his outstretched arm seemed merely to hail the beauty swinging toward him, we see now that it also holds the rose bushes out of the way, so that he can see her more clearly. And as one realizes how encompassing these bushes are, another question surfaces. Are the two men conscious of each other? In fact, it may well be that the woman and the dog are the only ones in the painting fully aware of what's going on. And as for the woman, as layers of varnish were removed, it became clear the lengths to which Fragonard went to make sure that she was in the very center of the composition, framed at every side by twisting lines that converge on her dynamic figure. She's now more sensual, less doll-like than had been realized, with the contours of her body now clearly on display, and a gentle undertone of blue evoking the pulse of blood under her flesh. The elegance of her dress is matched by the opulence of the swing on which she sits. The seat seems to be upholstered in soft velvet, affixed to a gilded wooden base. But the ropes that bind this seat to the tree are coarse and thick, and what's more, they're starting to fray. And the surprising contrast between the elegant seat and the coarse ropes is echoed in her gesture, which initially seemed to playfully imitate that of Falconet's Cupid, but now seems a gesture of a different sort, because her little finger is raised as well as her index finger. This hand movement is reminiscent of the earthy gestures then associated with Naples, and popularized by Fragonard's contemporary, Jean-Baptiste Greuze, in paintings of Italian peasant life. It seems specifically incongruous with the mannered elegance of this lady's dress. And what about the space where this all takes place? There seems to be a fountain in the background, perhaps reminiscent of the fantastic water theater of the Villa d'Este, where Fragonard spent a summer drawing in the company of fellow artist Hubert Robert and their patron, the Abbé de Saint-Non. Against this distant fountain is silhouetted what may be an embracing couple, hinting at some kind of outdoor gathering, hinting of the pleasurable activities that will follow the game of the swing. And because typically we would be doing this lecture in a lecture theater with a pointer so that I could show you all what exactly I'm talking about, I just ask you to look slightly to the right of the pedestal on which menacing Cupid sits, and you can see the embracing couple. And then directly behind that embracing couple, you see this sort of enormous fall of water, which I think comes from a sort of jet d'eau, one of these huge fountains that Fragonard would have seen in Italy. For me, some of the broad questions raised by this painting can be summarized as follows. Are we meant to read anything into the color of the woman's dress? In the 18th century, pink was closely associated with the royal mistress, Madame de Pompadour, but it was also worn regularly by male protagonists. The young man in the swing wears pink flowers in his lapel. Who are the three main characters and what is their relationship? How does their dress relate to their status within the painting and to their walk in life? How playful is this painting, really? And finally, to what extent should this work be read in conjunction with 18th century libertine literature, specifically the descriptions by the likes of Crébillon or Vivant de Nom of sophisticated parties in the estates of chateaux outside of Paris? To explore these strands further, I invited 5 scholars and 5 artists or art practitioners to participate in a series of forthcoming conversations entitled Swing Time, Serendipitous Conversations about the Rococo. The program kicked off on November 8th with a conversation about the color pink with curator Valerie Steele and artist Flora Yukonovich. These speakers represent a diverse range of professional and lived experiences, but they all engage with the Rococo in their daily working lives and shape their own visions of it. For instance, Turner Prize nominated artist Catherine Yass, who will be speaking on Monday, 23rd November, is currently gathering material for her own artistic response to the painting. Our other speaker for the same talk, Rosalyn Mckeever, is working on male fashions and identity in her upcoming show for the Victoria and Albert Museum. The talk on fashion features haute couture designer Sami Nouri, who arrived in France as a refugee from Afghanistan, trained with John Galliano and Jean-Paul Gaultier, and now runs his own atelier in Paris. French specialist of libertine literature and member of the Académie Française, Chantal Thomas, is also a novelist who places women at the heart of her works, such as Les Adieux à la Reine, or Farewell, My Queen, about the last days of Marie Antoinette at the Château de Versailles. I hope that bringing together their diverse voices in these talks, which are free, thanks to the Bank of America grant, will open up larger conversations about the relevance of the painting and the Rococo aesthetic in general. Now, in the time remaining to me, I want to focus in on my reading of the picture and begin to sketch out the direction that I'm taking in my own forthcoming response to this complex work. As we've seen, the conservation project has revealed the extent to which Fragonard lovingly enriched this painting with sumptuous detail. In the process, it has given us more information about the players who make up this work, whether human, animal, or statuary. But there are also those who are named but unseen, who have left their mark within and around the territory of the painted surface. Let us start not with a name, but with a place, the Petite Maison, or pleasure house, to which the unnamed gentleman of the court invited the artist Doyen. The term Petite Maison translates literally to little house. In the 18th century, such diminutive structures with beautifully disposed gardens proliferated in the outskirts of the French capital, in suburbs such as Bercy, Passy, Clichy, or Montrouge. And I'm showing you here an example of one such pleasure house, the Château de Bagatelle in the Bois de Boulogne, which was built in 1775 by the Comte d'Artois. And of course, it's a place that has other significance for the Wallace Collection, as has been discussed by various colleagues of mine over the years. Thanks to their locations, the Petite Maison were easily accessible from Paris, but they also offered secrecy and privacy, a space for the types of interactions that could blossom away from the curious and insistent gaze of Parisian society. In these secluded spaces, desire was given free rein. In fact, the libertine novella La Petite Maison by Jean-François de Bastide, published in 1758 and again in 1763, so just 4 years before Fragonard's painting, The Swing, the La Petite Maison describes the seduction of a young woman as the direct result of her visit to an admirer's petite maison. She finds herself overwhelmed not by his charms, but by the sensory pleasures aroused by the unmistakable luxury of the house itself. And so this is an illustration given to a 19th century edition of the book, and it shows this very sort of enclosed interior with beautiful furniture and boiserie and lighting. It's a space of seduction and of luxury. Despite their diminutive size, these houses were synonymous not just with pleasure, but indeed with luxury. And in fact, one satirical text dating from the 1750s suggests that their liquidation, so selling off all of the petites maisons around Paris, could solve France's national debt crisis. The author went on to remark, one only needs an income of 30,000 livres to maintain a large house. To maintain a petite maison, one needs 100,000 livres at the very minimum. They are usually havens of pleasure and wealth. As a result, such houses were the preserve of wealthy aristocrats, the very upper echelons of the bourgeoisie, and the nouveau riche tax farmers, or fermiers généraux, as they were called. This brings us naturally to the mysterious patron, the unnamed gentleman of the court who commissioned the swing. In 1860, this man was identified by the art historian Roger Portalis as one Saint-Julien, a collector who owned other key works by Fragonard, notably the Colin Maillard and La Bascule, so Blind Man's Buff and The Seesaw, both scenes of play in a garden setting. But in 1989, this theory of Saint-Julien was debunked by none other than John Ingemels, who pointed out rightly that Portalis was partially basing his assertion on a non-existent sale. Moreover, those who took up the identification in Portalis' wake went on to confuse La Bascule, a representation of two lovers and a seesaw, with L'Escarpolette, or the swing, and say that the La Bascule, which was indeed listed in one sale by Saint-Julien, although not the one, as Ingemels pointed out, to which everyone was referring, that this painting was in fact L'Escarpolette, whereas it's a different work altogether. So Ingemels set the record straight in 1989, but he was unable to propose another name in place of Saint-Julien. And the identity of the patron continues to this day to remain maddeningly elusive. Barring the discovery of new archival material, it may prove impossible to clinch definitively, although I do hope not, but we'll see. Nonetheless, a closer look at the two names that have always been associated with this painting does give us, as we wait for a new discovery, does give us flickers of understanding about the personality conjured up in Collet's anecdote, the gentleman of the court wealthy enough to own a petite maison. So I suggest that by looking at these two names, we can start to at least understand the motivations of the collector, even as his identity still remains a mystery. So the first name is, of course, the man who for so many years was identified as the commissioner of the swing, Saint-Julien. His full name, David François Beaulieu, Baron d'Argental, Seigneur de Saint-Julien, who is shown here in a portrait by Carmontel, approximately 2 years before the swing was commissioned, at which time the sitter was about 52 years of age. One reason the identification has continued to resonate is that Saint-Julien held the powerful charge of Receveur du Clergé de France, that is, collector of taxes on behalf of the French church. He would therefore have had a ready interest in the goings-on of France's powerful First Estate, and perhaps he would even humorously wish to see a bishop painted into his picture. The second name associated with the painting is that of another tax farmer, François-Marie Ménage de Pressini. We know that this gentleman is the first certain owner of the swing because the work was cataloged in his collection in 1794 at the height of the Terror. This was the year in which all of his possessions were seized by the French revolutionary government. Ménage de Pressini himself was executed by guillotine on the charge of having adulterated tobacco with water and other substances. And we know that Ménage de Pressini had a connection to Fragonard because he owned the painting of which I'm showing you here, the engraving. And you can see at the bottom that in the letter of the engraving, the dedication of the engraving, that is, Nicolas de Delaunay, who has engraved it, has made the dedication to Ménage de Pressini in his status as the owner of the work. Would either of these men have owned a petite maison? They certainly had the financial wherewithal to do so. Saint-Julien's position in the church made him wildly wealthy. He was known for having the most sumptuous dining room in the French capital, a room, it was said ironically, in which 120 priests could gather to discuss articles of faith. Saint-Julien was also known for having made numerous improvements to his wife's estate, the Château de la Fontaine Française in Burgundy, of which I'm showing you the gardens here, to the point that he transformed the venerable edifice into a palace so sparkling, so luxurious, and so new that the lady in question is said to have taken one horrified look at the transformation of her former ancestral home and departed for Paris post-haste. Madame de Saint-Julien was quite resistant to the work that her husband undertook, rather over her head, it seems. Nonetheless, he had his way and transformed the estate, and a description of the garden of the Château de la Fontaine Française, written in 1783, has come down to us. And so I quote, "Art, taste, opulence seem to have exhausted themselves in making a palace of delight. The parks, the waters, the symmetry of the clearings and the woods, everything was done to make the outdoors agreeable. The gardens are huge and designed with art. At each step, we see interesting and new objects. Here, a humble linden tree, further on, a bower of lilac and honeysuckle, where the queen of flowers appears in all her glory and mixes her perfume with those of her companions. These are charming spaces where one dreams of pleasure and where desire awakens in the face of nature." So it's pure conjecture, but it's certainly tempting to imagine that the man responsible for such a garden could easily have engineered the Italianate water theater and hidden bowers, documented with such striking, painstaking detail in the swing. Now, as for Ménage de Pressini, he was also, as we've seen, an extremely wealthy tax collector who was known to have been an habitué at parties held at petites maisons belonging to his friends. It was said of these gatherings that the champagne arrived in casks, the firework displays regularly illuminated the gardens, and the revelry went on until dawn. As is faithfully recorded in the police records of the era, this gentleman also maintained his own establishment, so his own petite maison, at number 25 Rue du Housset, where he carried on an infamous affair with a young dancer from the Paris Opera, until that is, she grew tired of his irascible character and left him at the end of 8 days. So much for the type of personality who might have commissioned the swing. What of the artist who was invited to the petite maison, the one who ultimately refused the commission? The solid Gabriel François Doyen is shown on my slide with all of the trappings of conventional academic painting beside him. Homer's The Iliad is within easy reach. And I'm not sure how easy it is to see here, but you can just make out the title if you look right under the way in which he's holding his portfolio. And actually the drawing stylus that he's holding seems to be pointing at the volume. So Homer's The Iliad is within easy reach, and the sketch on the easel shows a scene involving the Phrygian goddess Cybele. Today, Doyen is perhaps best known for declining the opportunity to make the swing. But in 1767, when he was summoned to the pleasure house of the unnamed gentleman of the court, he was justly famed for a very different type of art. And that pertains to the work that I'm also showing on this slide, The Miracle of the Ardennes, which I will be discussing now. The public salon exhibition, the biennial event at which artists displayed their greatest achievements in order to court the interest of the public, the monarchy, and the church, had just opened a couple of months before, so before 1767. And Doyen had emerged from this event covered in glory. His contribution to the Salon of that year, so 1767, The Miracle of Ardennes, was not only one of the largest works shown, but also one of the most meaningful to the people of Paris. It represented Saint Geneviève, the patron saint of the city, interceding on behalf of those stricken by an epidemic plague known as the mal des ardents, what we know today as ergot poisoning from ingesting fungus-infested bread. Following the closure of the Salon, it was taken to one of the transept chapels in the Church of Saint-Roch on the Rue Saint-Honoré, where the painting remains to this day. That he was fresh from this triumph doubtless explains Doyen's scandalized response in the face of the unnamed gentleman's request. I admit, Doyen later told Collet, that this proposition, which I should never have expected given the nature of the painting that he wanted me to do, confused and petrified me. But in fact, before he made a name for himself as a history painter, Doyen had been heavily infatuated with one Adélaïde Louise Pauline Huth, a well-known actress at the Comédie Française and a notorious courtesan. His feelings so completely overpowered him that at one point it was publicly said that he languished in a state of love-induced laziness, having lost all will to work. This fact should certainly not call into question our understanding of Doyen's motives in turning down the commission for the swing. But it does go some way toward explaining why the patron would have thought to call upon Doyen in the first place. Not only was he an up-and-coming painter of high-minded art, but he was also known for his open admiration for one of the most beautiful women of Paris. In other words, on paper, he appeared equipped to paint two of the commission's major requirements, the pretty mistress and the bishop. Yet, as we know, the bishop never made it into the painting. And what is present on the canvas tells a rather different story. The swing is made with enormous care. This much is evident from close looking. And it's finished to a high degree, even one might say, with an obsessiveness that we don't typically associate with Fragonard's highly gestural style. But it must be said that none of the beautifully painted figures come off as particularly sympathetic. The besotted older man, with his grimacing mouth and age-spotted skin, is oblivious to everything around him, even the distress of his little dog. The young woman, who soars over the two men, appears to have tremendous agency. It is, after all, her movements that attract attention, and the pointed toe and outstretched leg imply that she's showing herself consensually, rather than being spied upon. But her hand gesture suggests that she uses her moment in the spotlight to poke fun, or to play the two men off against each other. And while she's clearly in command of her sexuality, it's still from the vantage point of a child's toy. Similarly, contradictory adjectives can be applied to the young man, who lurks in the lower left of the picture. Vigorous and amorous, but also callous, voyeuristic, and even potentially ridiculous. For one thing, he's lying in the midst of thorny rose bushes to catch a glimpse of a woman. For another, the bright flush on his cheeks, which outshines even the complexion of the young woman, is probably the result of rouge. Makeup was an affectation in which men of the period engaged, but those who did risked being called petit maître or fops, and described in terms of artifice and luxury. For Enlightenment philosopher Denis Diderot, A petit maître was a man who wore rouge, wigs, and dressed in the latest fashions. Diderot had harsh words for François Boucher, Fragonard's teacher, whose pink-cheeked, painted figures appealed precisely to such a lot. And so I quote Diderot. Boucher's elegance, his affected winsomeness, his novelistic gallantry, his coquetry, his taste, his facility, variety, brilliance, his made-up complexions, his debauchery, necessarily captivate petit maîtres, little women, young men, the crowd of those who are strangers to real taste, to the truth, to just ideas, and to the seriousness of art. How could they resist the ostentation, the libertinage, the brilliancy, the pom-poms, the bosoms, and the bottoms of Boucher? All in all, one wonders just what the unnamed gentleman of the court thought of this work. Not the one he commissioned, but the one he ultimately received. He expected a lighthearted confection, showing a bishop abetting a love affair. Instead, he received a bittersweet tangle of emotions, staged between three antiheroes, a work that seems to be as much about betrayal and impending loss, and a rather sharp dig at artifice, as about the pleasures of a summer's evening. And so here at last, we catch a glimpse of the artist, not of the steady, reliable doyen who had been asked to take on this painting initially, but rather of the complicated, volatile one who did. Rotund, well-fed, lively, always alert, always cheerful. These are terms used by Fragonard's biographers to describe him in the 19th century. Are they accurate? In physical terms, Fragonard was known to be diminutive, just under 5 feet 6 inches, with gray eyes that appear to twinkle benevolently in his own drawing of himself, a self-portrait now in the Musée du Louvre. But in reality, we know very little. Fragonard left nothing in writing. He did not seem to have kept a journal, and if he wrote letters, they do not survive today. Few archival documents exist to provide insight into his thoughts, his doings, his motivations, his spending habits, his circle of friends. Rare commentaries by the artist's contemporaries in the 18th century seem to contradict the 19th century image of the jovial artist, painting a picture in which he emerges as anxious and painfully self-aware. Mariette, the famed drawing collector, wrote tartly of his timidity, his maddening habit of erasing his works and starting over again and again. The powerful arts administrator, Charles-Nicolas Cauchin, wrote of his excessive self-distrust. A peeved client, the wealthy financier Bergeret de Grandcourt, derided Fragonard as weak, a coward, a milquetoast, an imposter, in the wake of their disastrous trip to Italy in 1773. There is one thing we know for sure about Fragonard. Over the course of his career, he made a habit of disregarding the wishes of powerful patrons, even to the point of stoking severe disagreements. The list of casualties include the royal mistress, Madame de Berry, whose commission he put off making to the point that it literally became irrelevant, and the aforementioned financier Bergeret de Grandcourt, whose disagreement with Fragonard resulted in a court battle, no less. It also includes the beautiful dancer Mademoiselle Guimard, whose spectacular fallout with Fragonard in the early 1770s would become stuff of Parisian legend. So I'll go into a few details about that commission. Fragonard was asked to produce 4 large mythological panels to decorate the Grand Salon of Guimard's new Hôtel Particulier in Paris. Following a disagreement over price, Fragonard left the job undone, and Mademoiselle Guimard hired the much younger Jacques-Louis David to finish the work. And it's David's portrait of the dancer that's shown here. Fragonard clearly remained resentful over the entire experience, with the following results duly recorded in the Correspondance littéraire of 1773. And so I quote, "The Hôtel of Mademoiselle Guimard is almost finished. The salon is entirely decorated with paintings. Mademoiselle Guimard is represented as Terpsichore, the muse of dance, with all the attributes to characterize her thus in the most seductive manner. These paintings were not yet finished when, for some reason, I don't know why, she broke off relations with the painter, Monsieur Fragonard. Their quarrel was so violent that he was fired, and she found another artist. Since, curious to know what had happened to the job in the hands of his successor, Fragonard found a way back into the house. He managed to get to the salon without meeting anyone. Seeing in a corner a palette and some paint, he thought spontaneously of a way of getting his revenge. With 4 strokes of the brush, he erased the smile on the lips of Terpsichore, giving the portrait an expression of anger and fury, but without altering the resemblance to La Guimard. His sacrilege completed, he left as quickly as possible. By an unfortunate chance, Mademoiselle Guimard arrived a few minutes later with several of her friends who wanted to ascertain the talents of the new painter. Imagine her indignation at seeing herself so disfigured. But the angrier she became, the more the portrait resembled her. End quote. This incident occurred 4 years after the swing. But just before the making of the swing, Fragonard had experienced another such confrontation, although this time not exactly one of his making. In the years leading up to 1767, he had been tipped as the new leader of the French school, the up-and-coming artist who was going to take painting to new heights by continuing in the tradition of history painting, compositions taken from the Bible, classical mythology, or history, and designed to instill moral values in the hearts and minds of beholders. And of course, as you all realize by now, Doyen was very much a history painter by making his religious painting now in the Church of Saint-Roch. In 1765, Fragonard presented his requisite admission piece to the Royal Academy, the work of art submitted as the first step in the long initiation process to become a full-fledged artist. Fragonard's submission, an ambitious, highly imaginative, large-scale history painting known as Carasius and Caliroe, was an immediate and brilliant success, and that, of course, is the work that I'm showing you here. The painting was purchased for an astounding promised payment of 2,400 livres by the king, who also commissioned a companion piece. A few months later, Carasius and Caliroe was exhibited in public at the Salon of 1765 to the enthusiastic praise of Diderot, who discussed the picture at length in his Salon review and predicted that Fragonard would become France's next major history painter. For Fragonard, the immediate material result of this brilliant success was that he was given lodgings in the Louvre, along with the other established artists of his day. But financial stability was not forthcoming. He received an installment towards the promised 2,400 livres from the crown in August 1765, but he did not receive a final payment for another 8 years, until January 1773. And this, notwithstanding repeated pleas on his behalf from the secretary of the Academy. The situation became so dire that the contemporary novelist Sébastien Mercier, writing in the 1770s, noted that the artist was even obliged to pawn his clothes to make ends meet. It was at this critical moment that he received the scandalous commission for the swing, and he never looked back. From then on, rather than working within the parameters of the French Royal Academy, Fragonard took on private commissions and broke away entirely from the clear-cut moralistic messaging of official art. From thenceforth, he refused every crown commission he was offered. Even when asked to paint 2 subjects of his own choosing for the dining room at Versailles in 1770, he did not relent. To conclude, given Fragonard's bumpy track record with clients, given the fact that he went on to skewer Mademoiselle Guimard precisely by turning on its head a portrait of her, given the wide gap we can surmise between the players represented on the canvas and those we can glimpse behind the scenes of the swing, it seems fair to say that at some point in the course of its making, the swing took a rather sizable detour. It went from being a work carefully planned out by a patron to a work in which the artist expresses his own voice. For it seems clear to me that the swing is the painting Fragonard wanted to make, rather than the work he was asked to make. And the voice that comes through as a result seems defiant, even brave. Fragonard has painted a work that is dizzying in its impossibility to pin down, and he has done so with a technical prowess designed to stop the viewer dead in his tracks. Perhaps in bringing to bear the full force of his artistic prowess on the swing, Fragonard intended to send a message. Perhaps he wanted to subtly let the academic art world know what it would be missing henceforth. It is certainly possible to see the painting as an end, as a final sign-off from a disgruntled history painter. But the painting is also emblematic of what was to be gained by breaking away. Following the swing, Fragonard's stories were no longer inspiring ones of gods and kings. But just as significant was his new manner of telling them, ambiguous, confusing, insinuating. After he stepped away from the academy, there is nothing straightforward about anything Fragonard did. In its determined aversion to clear narrative, the swing is in many ways the ultimate anti-history painting. It is an experimental work that teases us with its ambiguity, that lingers in the mind, that makes us think. In this sense, perhaps, it should be read not simply as the embodiment of the rococo, but as the dawn of modern art. Thank you.